Hi Year 8 and welcome to week 3 of Unseen Poems. I'm hoping that a few of you had a look at the video that I made last week and that a few more of you will look at the one that I'm going to produce today to help you with this poem, Born Yesterday. I noticed last week that lots of you responded to the prompt questions, but a few less of you actually tried to write 200 words responding to the key question as a whole. So I'm going to try and model separately how you might go about doing that. So let's have a look at Born Yesterday. So your job, of course, is to read the poem out loud to yourself. I'm sure you can find people on YouTube reading it for you if you want to, but I really recommend that you read it yourself out loud, first of all, because it's one of the best ways of trying to get to know the poem and understand the words and the meanings and the imagery and the various resonances and meanings that they might have. So what we know about this poem is that Philip Larkin wrote it when his friend had a baby, and that baby was called Sally, and he wrote this poem for her. So the first prompt question that you only need to answer in brief notes is, what does the phrase tightly folded bud suggest? Why use bud to compare to the baby? Well, a bud, as I'm sure you know, is kind of like the very, very beginnings of a flower. Okay, so it starts off as a bud and then it tends to kind of open up in time, and then eventually that bud might become a flower. I'm not quite sure that those are my finest drawings ever, but you might like to think about how a baby is a little bit like a bud. When a baby, if you've ever seen a newborn baby, when it's first born, it has to be all folded up really, really tightly because it's spent 9 months stuck in its mum's tummy or in her womb. So perhaps that's one of the reasons why a bud might be appropriate for a baby. But I guess also thinking about that metaphor of a baby being a bit like a bud. When a bud first appears, we don't really know what it's going to look like. We can see that there's some potential for that, but it could be turning into a peony or a rose or any kind of flower. And I guess there's also encapsulated in that image of a bud of some unknown potential and beauty that is yet to be realised. So hopefully that gives you enough ideas about question 1. Okay, so question 2. What does the first stanza allude to? What scene is the poet recreating? So remember that stanza is a special word for verse, really. So from primary school, you might have thought about poems being in verses, but we're trying to get you used to the word stanza. So the question is asking you to think about just this first stanza here. And it says, what scene is the first stanza alluding to, and what scene is the poet recreating? Okay, so he says, tightly folded bud, I've wished you something none of the others would. Not the usual stuff about being beautiful or running off a spring of innocence and love. They will all wish you that. And should it prove possible, well, you're a lucky girl. Well, this really reminds me of a pretty famous Disney film. Anyone familiar with Princess Aurora and Sleeping Beauty? It's kind of a reference to that fairy tale and the idea of when a baby is born, there's a tradition of lots of people visiting and making wishes for the baby. And the poet is saying that perhaps he's thinking that there's enough people wishing the baby to be beautiful and have innocence and love, and that maybe if those things are possible, that the baby will be lucky. But I think he's setting out the ground that he wants to be different, a little bit like, I think it's the fourth fairy in Sleeping Beauty who wishes something different. So I think that's what's going on there. Question 3. What does "should it prove possible" suggest about the poet's own life experiences? So that's this bit. So this is where we get to learn a little bit about the poet himself, maybe being a little bit cynical. Okay, so maybe he just brings a little bit of his own bitter life experience to this. Maybe he knows enough about life to be kind of just suggesting to us that it's not really possible for us all to be beautiful and for us all to have money and happiness and success and strings of friends and all of those things. Perhaps he's sort of suggesting to us that, maybe those things are a little bit hard to come by. I don't know. He says, if it is possible, you're very lucky. Okay, let's look at the second stanza. He says, but if it shouldn't. So I think this is quite an interesting turning point here, really, because we've got this word but. He says, but if it shouldn't, then may you be ordinary. Okay, have, like other women, an average of talents. So here the poet seems to be saying it would just be really good if you could just be ordinary, if you could be nothing special. Okay, he says, have, like other women, an average of talents, not ugly, not good looking, nothing uncustomary to pull you off your balance. That unworkable itself stops all the rest from working. So here he seems to be suggesting that sometimes it can be really difficult. If you're really exceptional at something, then it can make other parts of your life really different or really difficult. So he's just saying, actually, it's an unusual thing to wish somebody, but perhaps actually the best thing to wish for of all is for somebody just to be normal, just to have nothing that makes them stand out from the crowd. And maybe that's the thing that helps most of all in the end, is just to be normal. He says, so the fifth question is, what does the phrase catching of happiness suggest in line 24? So let's read to the end. He says, in fact, may you be dull, if that is what a skilled, vigilant, flexible, unemphasized, enthralled catching of happiness is called. And I think it's this idea that happiness, being happy, can be something that's really quite difficult for lots of people to achieve. And I think it's this idea that happiness is a bit elusive. It's difficult to grab. And perhaps he's saying that actually just being normal, having nothing particularly special about you, might be the easiest way to be happy. Let's go back to the title for question 6. It says, born yesterday usually describes someone who's naive and clueless. Why did Larkin choose this title? Why is it effective? Well, born yesterday. So it would be appropriate because the baby will have only just been born. So that's kind of one reason why it's appropriate, because it's kind of marking their birth. But like it says in the question, being born yesterday, were you born yesterday? It's sort of suggesting that you lack experience or you haven't learnt anything. So maybe the poet is talking about all of these other people lacking the experience that he's gained. Maybe he thinks that people who come along and just wish that babies are, beautiful and that they have a lovely life full of all the lovely stuff, maybe they're being a little bit naive, because actually I think he feels that his position of developing all these other skills, of being skilled and vigilant and flexible and all of those things are more valuable. So perhaps he thinks that everybody else is being a bit naive or a bit silly. Okay, I hope that's been some help. As I say, my intention is to create another video for you that will maybe show you how you could go about writing 200 words about a poem like this. Well done.